If you were there when they signed the Constitution. Pages 49 to 57. What was the problem hidden in the Great Compromise? The problem was how to count the slaves. There were 600,000 African Americans in the country. 90% of them were slaves in the South. Under the compromise, the more people a state had, the more representatives it would have, and the more power. The southern states wanted to count their slaves as people. Of course, the slaves could not vote, but women and children were counted as people, and they couldn't vote either. The northern states didn't want to count the slaves. They argued if the slaves could be bought and sold, they were no different from horses or mules. Gouverneur Morris said slavery was the curse of heaven. Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Once again, the delegates worked out a compromise. Slaves would be counted as 3/5. In other words, 5 slaves would count as 3 whites. What other compromises did the North make with the South? Although most people in the North were not ready to end slavery altogether, many people hated the slave trade. Almost everyone had heard horror stories about the long voyage from West Africa. Men, women, and children were chained to their bunks, lying like logs so the ships could fit in as many as possible. Many slaves tried to kill themselves by jumping overboard. The South was afraid that a new national government would write a law that would stop the slave trade. During the summer of 1787, the men in Philadelphia were not the only ones struggling with the question of slavery. There was still an old Congress under the Articles of Confederation, and this Congress was still meeting in New York City. Many people like Madison were going back and forth between New York and Philadelphia. In the middle of the summer, the old Congress settled a long debate. Would the land in the West be settled by freemen or by slaves? Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, which said that all land north of the Ohio River would be forever free. No slavery would be allowed there. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison came back down to Philadelphia and told the delegates what had happened in Congress. Today, some historians think that a deal was made. The North had won in the Northwest. Now the South was going to get its way in the Constitution. Is the word slave in the Constitution? No. If you read the original Constitution, you can see that they never used the word slave or slavery. Our Constitution is mostly written in clear and beautiful English, but when it came to slavery, the delegates used very confusing words. They didn't want to put the word slave into their Constitution. The Constitution has lasted 200 years, but it was almost destroyed during the Civil War over the issue of slavery. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln would say the word slavery was hid away in the Constitution, just as an afflicted man hides away a cancer which he dares not cut out at once, lest he bleed to death. Abraham Lincoln was president in 1865 when the Congress amended the Constitution to make slavery illegal. Did the delegates do nothing but fight? No. In fact, some historians think that they agreed on more than they disagreed. Almost all the delegates had been rebels against the King of England. They believed that the king had too much power. If men were angels, said James Madison, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, no controls on government would be necessary. Basically, the delegates agreed with Madison. They knew their greatest challenge was to set up a government with enough power to act, but they wanted to be sure that the government did not have too much power. The delegates wanted their new government to have different branches that could check each other, so no single branch could have too much power. They thought the best government had what they called separation of powers and checks and balances. That meant no one person or group could make laws for everyone else. How did the delegates invent a president? The men at Philadelphia knew firsthand what it was like to be ruled by a king. They wanted to make sure that no one man could ever have as much power as a king. But on the other hand, they had lived for 12 years under a system when there was no head of the government, and they hadn't worked very well. At the Philadelphia Convention during the hot summer, they had invented a House of Representatives and a Senate to make up the laws. But what if the House and the Senate voted foolish laws? Who would stop them? Would they have to go through another revolution? Who would be president? The truth was that everyone in the room knew exactly who would be the first president. They had been looking at him all summer. It was George Washington. But they knew Washington couldn't live forever. Remember, they were inventing a new office, president. Who should pick the president? They went round and round on this question. First, they voted that president should be picked by the Senate, but then they didn't like that. James Wilson from Philadelphia kept arguing that the president should be elected by the people as a whole. This was a lot for the delegates to swallow. It was rare for anyone in Georgia to know anyone in Massachusetts. How would anyone ever know who would be the best president? In the end, the delegates made up an electoral college. Although the electoral college is a strange and complicated system, James Wilson was right. Almost from the beginning, the president came to be seen as not just from one state, but as someone who had to represent all the people. This is the end of today's lesson.